Welcome back to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson.
And I'm your host, Nelly.
I'm your host, Yasmin.
I'm your host, Sarah.
I'm your host, Emmy.
I'm your host, Bosco.
And I'm your host, Samantha Haley.
Last season was an interview-based podcast focused on the educational trajectories of anti-Zionist Jewish folks like myself involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. This season, the 7 of us are turning a graduate course called Education, Genocide, Liberation into a collective project. So, what's this season about? Well, it's about the many roles education plays across time and space. So, we might say,
school is a place of emancipation, or conversely, indoctrination, where younger generations learn and adapt to the order of things.
Schools also act as a site of genocide. Torture, enslavement, the destruction of culture, and murder have all been carried out in schools and through educational process.
But schools can be sanctuaries, spaces of art. School can even be a place to build other kinds of worlds.
And outside of school, what is learned from a book burning? How does censorship create a curriculum of compliance?
Amidst social movements, how does teaching flow through revolutionary fervor on the streets? How is education a critical tool to survival and active resistance against oppression?
These ideas and the ways that they collide, coexist, and compete sit at the core of our course and podcast. We think that whether you are a teacher, professor, activist, or anyone who has asked these big critical questions about what education does in the world, this podcast is for you.
We'll have episodes about schools and educational projects in the US, Argentina, Palestine, and many other places.
We'll look at histories, futures, and presents, at abolitionist ideas or social reproductive ideas.
All of this is to say that through interviews with scholars and activists across a range of fields, we'll look at the often underexplored, divergent, and competing roles of education.
The goal here is to learn about the context, to study what education looks like within it, and to explore how education works both for and against its ideas.
Say we look at climate change. Our guest would teach us about climate change. Then maybe we look at how education functions within that context. What does it look like when schools don't have the infrastructure to support students during climate disasters? Things like that. From there, how does education act for our weekly topic? In other words, how are schools, education policies, public pedagogies, and so on acting to further climate change, to deny us addressing it, and so on? Conversely, how does education work against these things? How might education fight climate change?
the goal of this podcast is ultimately to show the force of education. That force might move in different directions, but as many have said, education is never neutral. And the goal is also to make something public, to create resources for ourselves and our listeners as we study and struggle with education itself, and to challenge ourselves and anyone listening to think about education in more complex ways while still remembering and returning to its radical potential. So we hope you'll join us for this new season of Another Education is Possible.